today we are going to go over another batch of rulings from the Legacy Rules team and also some from the Modern Rules team. And we're just going to go over these one at a time. This blog post that you're seeing here on the screen is going to be made available and will be linked in the description, which will just very briefly summarize each of the various problems and the decision that the appropriate rules team came to. I'm not going to go over these because these are just a summary, but it will be posted everywhere for you to review. Instead, I'm going to be going onto the wiki and looking at the individual ruling articles for each of these decisions as they go into detail. So, number 1, we're going to look at, well, I guess it's number 4, really. Legacy ruling number 4 is going to go over Harrowdale. So Harrowdale is a site from set 11. It states, until the regroup phase, each minion skirmishing a Rohan companion loses fierce and cannot gain fierce. So the main concern here is that there's two ways that you could read the card. You can either read it as saying, when the fellowship moves to or from this site, whether you start the turn at Harrowdale or whether you move to it at the end of the fellowship phase, then the following is in force until the regroup phase. At the start of each skirmish involving a Rohan companion, make each minion in that skirmish lose fierce and unable to gain fierce until the regroup phase. The second way that you can read it is only while at this site, once you've moved to it, then at the start of each skirmish involving a Rohan companion, make each minion in that skirmish lose fierce and unable to gain fierce until the regroup phase. The basic difference is that version A here is a 2-site version where you could begin the turn at Harrowdale and its effects will follow you onto the following site. And option B is a 1-site version that only works while you're at it, and when you move away from it, there's no continuation. Perhaps the main thrust of the question comes from the observation that if this card is clearly, it's clearly intended to benefit the Rohan player, but if it is option B, then they only gain benefit if their opponent plays it for them, unless they play it themselves using an effect like Pathfinder or one of those various other cards. So So basically, it comes down to we need to figure out what exactly is until the regroup phase modifying. Is it talking about until the regroup phase you have this whole effect? Or are we saying until the regroup phase, the minions lose fierce and cannot gain fierce until the regroup phase? There are a few cards that we can look at. So from the first 3 sets in Fellowship Block, there are a number of cards that deal with pulling down allies, and most of them say until the regroup phase, that ally is strength +3 and participates in archery, fire, and skirmishes. I think the primary reason why these are worded that way is because there are 2 effects. Namely, that ally being strength +3, and they can participate in archery, fire, and skirmishes, and thus regroup phase is supposed to modify both of those. We can also see the same sort of wording on File of Galadriel Starglass that once again says until the regroup phase, remove the game text from a minion, skirmishing bearer, and make it unable to gain text. So once again, you have 2 things that is going on, and so until the regroup phase modifies both of them. Sack of the Shire states if an Isengard minion wins a skirmish until the regroup phase, make that minion strength +1 for each site you control, and fierce. So this is once again 2 different things that are being modified, both of which are being extended until the regroup phase. And this one is most likely worded this way because the original Savagery to match their numbers did not in fact put regroup phase at the beginning, and so it was ambiguous whether the regroup phase portion was supposed to be just for fierce or if it was supposed to be for the fierce and for the strength bonus. And they had issued a ruling stating that it works for both of those things. So to avoid that issue in the future, they started putting regroup phase until the regroup phase at the start. So as for precedent here, in 2012, this exact same question was brought up actually when GEMP was first being set up way back in 2012. So one player attested that the Lord of the Rings Online TCG platform operated as option B, as in other words, using the 1-site version. But option A was mentioned as being done in physical casual play. Harrowdale is mentioned in an article on Decipher's website as clearly a fellowship-focused site, but leaves the execution unmentioned, so we were unable to find any definitive answers from Decipher themselves. And then as of the Grand Cart rework, which occurred late last year, it currently implements option B, which is to say that it actually that's not correct. It says that no, that was not actually option B. It was actually implementing option A. However, I believe that may have been made that way because of an earlier bug report and not because that's how it was originally coded. So anyway, I think that perhaps the most interesting argument was the one that was brought up by Marson S in that original bug report on the fledgling GIMP. I think that is the most conclusive, and his argument is the double dipping argument. That although we do have these examples of cards that use until the regroup phase to refer to two different things, in this case, it's not just two different things that are occurring, but we have two different classes of thing that the until the regroup phase portion has to be applying to. So not only is it applying to the losing fierce part of the card, but it also would have to apply for the entire effect. So you're kind of double dipping and requiring until the regroup phase to apply to two different kinds of things, which is sort of unprecedented, right? So anyway, the legacy rules team has opted for option B. So the following ruling is going to be added for Harrowdale. While the fellowship is at this site, at the start of each skirmish involving a Rohan companion, make each minion in that skirmish lose fierce and unable to gain fierce until the regroup phase. This effect does not follow the fellowship to a second site. So Harrowdale suffers from being a site which historically have very little space to clarify the exact way that they are meant to be read. This often results in sites needing to rely on non-standard wording or other space-saving tricks to squeeze all the text onto the card, and so it is common to need to be more lenient in the reading of sites to account for their narrow spacing. In that light, the alternate reading of Harrowdale is an attempt to decompress the wording and read more into it than what was actually written. However, any decompressed wording has to still be consistent and sensible. In particular, the two-site version relies on the regroup phase clause double dipping and applying to two things at once, the duration of the fierce clause and the duration of the effect itself. This stretches the text to the breaking point and makes it an unsuitable reading. So yeah, we are going to be modifying Harrowdale to follow the version B and make it so that it only works at one site. Which means that if you, as the Rohan player, want to take advantage of it, you either have to give it to your opponent when they move to it, or you have to play it using a pathfinding effect or something like that. All right, so that is that. Fairly straightforward for Harrowdale. So let's move on to the next one, Legacy Ruling number 5. So this is for White Hand Sieger, which is a very oddball minion released in set 18. So this states it's an Uruk-hai in the Uruk-hai culture. Damage +1 to play, spot an Uruk-hai minion, and you must control a site. So what exactly does that mean? There's two different ways to read this. You can read it to say to play, spot an Uruk-hai minion and a site you already control, or to play, spot an Uruk-hai minion and an uncontrolled site eligible to be controlled. You must take control of that site to play this minion. So there's actually some interesting arguments for both sides, right? On the one hand, this is a very unique concept if it requires you to take control of a site to be able to play the White Hand Sieger. There's no other card in the game that operates like this. However, there's also no other minion in the game that is a cost 0 printed on the card, so it does sort of seem like those may go hand in hand. But it is far more common for cards or effects to require for you to be able to use them in an advantageous state that you already control a site. So it does seem like that is much more common than the other reading. So if you take a look at the cards that were produced, Decipher was pretty inconsistent on how exactly it worded the verb control a site, because really the problem here is that we can't tell if this is a verb that you're supposed to control to take control of the site, or if it's trying to say that you must already control a site. And so that's kind of between the verb version or the adjective. So if we take a look at some of the cards that exist, we'll find that they use both versions pretty much interchangeably throughout the entire history of the game. We have cards like Hill Chief way back when site control was first released, saying spot a site you control. So it does not say it does not say you must control a site, but it says spot a site you control, so it explicitly uses the spot a site version. King Block doesn't have anything because they didn't really care about spotting the sites. They preferred about stacking on them. But then in set 17, we have land has changed that says you may then, make an Uruk-hai strength +2 or spot a site you control to make that Uruk-hai strength +3 instead. So this again explicitly spots the site, whereas White Hand Sieger does not. However, we also have the opposite version. Make a Dunland minion strength +2 or +4 if you control a site. So it doesn't specifically say spot. It just says if you control. And then we have that same thing in set 4 with Burn Every Village. We have the same verbiage in set 10 with Gothmog, which says while you control a site, as opposed to saying while you can spot a site you control. And then we have White Hand Berserker in set 17, saying that at the start of the archery phase, if you control a site, you may add 2 to the minion archery total. So once again, not using the word spot specifically, just sort of saying if you control, meaning if you already control, if there's already a site in your support area. But then we find that control as a verb is used both ways in all throughout the game. So it seems like take control would be the obvious verbiage to use because it is unambiguous, and we do see that on many cards. Hillman Band here says each time the Fellowship moves, you may spot another Dunland band to take control of a site, so it's unambiguous what's happening here. Siege Troop has a regroup action that says exert this minion twice to take control of a site, and Uruk Infantry in set 15 says regroup, exert 4 Uruk-hai minions or discard 3 Uruk-hai minions to take control of a site. So once again, unambiguous that this is the verb that is being utilized. But then we also have the opposite. Isengard Scout Troop says that each time an Isengard Orc wins a skirmish, you may exert this minion to control a site. So here we have an example where even way back in Towers block when site control was first introduced, here we have a verbiage that does not say take control, it just says to control a site. We then have Gorgoroth Swarm in set 10. This is when you play this minion, you may spot 6 companions and another besieger to play a besieger from your discard pile and control a site. So once again, you're being given the instruction that you are supposed to be controlling the site. And you can notice that on these cards, they're not hurting for space, right? They're not completely packed all the way to the gills with 7 lines or 8 lines of text. They very easily could have included take control of a site, and that was not the case here. And then in set 18, we have Corsair Bow. This says each time a companion is killed during the archery phase, you may control a site. So we don't really have a good consensus on Decipher themselves. They waffled all throughout the entire history of the game from when site control was introduced all the way to set 17 and 18, never really taking a stand on whether or not this particular verbiage, control a site, should be taken as one way or the other. We have precedent for every kind of interpretation that you might take. Now, I'm gonna stepping aside from the official ruling of the Rules Council for a moment. I do think that there is a very interesting argument that is made by the user Dictionary on the Last Homely House. In 2018, he made the argument that must is a counterpart to may. So, for instance, if you were to see a phrase that said you may control a site, that this is supposed to be a counterpart, he argues, to the phrase you must control a site. So that both of those are really just referring to the same action, controlling a site, but they are stating whether or not it is an optional or a required action. And so in his view, to play spot an Uruk-hai minion and you must control a site is referring to, it is in contrast to the phrase to play spot an Uruk-hai minion and you may control a site. In both of those cases, we can see that it doesn't change the action that you are doing, taking control of a site. It just changes whether or not that is an optional or a required action. Let's see. And then there's also the fact that, so as this is a cost 0 minion, which has never been done on any other card in the game, we would expect that any sort of text that is here is limiting when you can do this. If we are going with the version that says that you must already control a site, then as soon as you do control a site, you can play 4 of these, boom, 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 one right after the other. All on the same site, all on different sites, it doesn't matter. However, if this is a version that requires that you take the action of taking control of a site for the first time, then that would severely restrict how many of these free White Hand Siegers you would be able to play. For instance, you would not be able to drop all 4 of them on the same site until at least site 5, because it would require you to take control of 4 sites in a row just to be able to play them. However, arguments or proponents of the other viewpoint also state that, well, it is cost 0, but even because it has that home site of site 5, you're still having to pay 2 for the roaming cost all the way up until site 5 anyway. So there is still a little bit of of breaks that are applied for the first half of that game that would also apply for that same time frame. So we have option A and option B that we've already gone over, and the Legacy Rules team has opted for option A. So we're going to be issuing a ruling that states that you are to read it as: to play, spot an Uruk-hai minion and a site you control. The site must already be controlled before this card may be played. All right, so that's the ruling that we're going to go for on that one. So let's go ahead and keep on trucking. Legacy ruling number 6. So this has to do with Saruman's staff. It's got a maneuver action that says make the first sentence of Saruman's game text not apply until the regroup phase. So this is pretty clear what it's supposed to be doing. Most of the versions of all of the versions of Saruman that were printed early on in the game have a first sentence that is something like the one here on Servant of the Eye. Saruman may not take wounds during the archery phase and may not be assigned to a skirmish. So by having Saruman's staff remove that first sentence, or make it not apply, then that basically means that this Saruman can take wounds during the archery phase and can be assigned to a skirmish. Most versions of Saruman do in fact follow that same layout, that same sort of concept. Rabble-Rouser says Saruman may not be assigned to a skirmish. Black Trader says Saruman may not take wounds during the archery phase and may not be assigned to a skirmish, and on and on. However, as time went on, especially as they got closer to the time period where Saruman's staff being in set 4 was to get rotated out, they started to be a little less careful in how they designed Saruman to make sure that it always had a first sentence that made sense to remove. So Master of Felfolk still does it, but then you have, and then Saruman, Instigator of Insurrection, also still has a sentence that makes sense. But then we get to this one, for instance, Saruman Coldly Still, that says each evil man minion bearing in possession is strength +2. Why on earth you would ever want to get rid of that? Well, I don't know. I suppose there might be an edge case where that would make sense. But here we have a sentence that you like. It's still obvious what the sentence is that is being gotten rid of. You just begin to question, why on earth am I getting rid of it? You have Kurunir. Each time an Uruk-hai hunter wins a skirmish, heal a different Uruk-hai minion. So you could disable that for some reason if you were feeling particularly spicy. Master of the White Hand. Each companion is resistance -1. If you really wanted to get rid of that, you could use Saruman's staff to do that. And then you have the V1 and V2 versions of Saruman, which were both designed to make sure that it is compatible with this particular staff. But then we have the 3 problematic Saruman that are not obvious as to how exactly they should work. So we have Saruman of Many Colors from set 12, who is damage +1, fierce, lurker. When you play Saruman, name a culture. Each companion of the named culture is strength -1. So which parts of this game text are supposed to be considered a sentence? Is it the damage +1? We have a period there. Is it the when you play Saruman, name a culture? That seems a little odd to target and get rid of. But things get even more tricky when we look at Saruman, Agent of the Dark Lord. So he's a lurker. So once again, you could make the argument that if his staff were to be used, it could get rid of that keyword, the lurker keyword. But then what's the next thing if it's not lurker? We have a skirmish ability that says exert Saruman to make an Uruk-hai minion strength +2. Is it that the Saruman staff gets rid of, or is it the last line, which is the first standalone sentence without any bold text? Each time a companion is killed, you may heal Saruman. Now, none of these are things that you would want to get rid of, I think, in most cases, except for maybe lurker. Maybe there could be a situation where you'd want Saruman to go first, but that would kind of, clash with the rest of his text anyway. Neither of these are in Saruman that I think anyone would want to actually activate their staff, but we do want to be consistent in how it performs on GEMP if someone does. There's also a third version of Saruman that this theoretically could affect, Saruman, Servant of Sauron. However, as a follower, he is barred in the game rules from being allowed to bear possessions or artifacts. So that's not really a problem, because that particular rule already kind of counts him out. So how exactly are we to interpret Saruman's staff working on these two versions of Saruman? I'll just skip straight to the end. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we have on here, but really it all just came down to how exactly did we want to perform this. So first of all, we have 3 different ways that we could handle it. And then we have 2 different ways that we could, or sorry, 3 different decisions that we could make, and then 2 different ways that we could implement that particular decision. We could either make an individual ruling for the cards, or we could add a new rules entry to define what exactly sentence means and how it is to be used in the future. For instance, if the modern team were to issue PC cards that utilize sentence, which I will point out, the PC did actually release a card, the White Council, that says, while you can spot Gandalf and 2 elven allies, the first sentence of Saruman's game text does not apply. This was really intended to be kind of a similar usage to Saruman's staff itself. You know, it is still tightly bound to how Saruman himself works, and so it doesn't have to consider how sentences work in other situations. But yeah, we could, in theory, continue issuing more things that have to do with sentences. But what the Legacy Rules Council has opted to do is to issue an individual card ruling. However, it's not going to be any of these options that were presented initially. The Legacy Rules Council has opted to rule that Saruman's staff does not interact with these 2 copies of Saruman at all. The Comprehensive Rules 4.2 will have the following individual ruling added to Saruman's staff that says the ability on Saruman's staff does not have any effect when used on Saruman of Many Colors or Saruman, Agent of the Dark Lord. Right? Short and simple. The Modern Rules team has also opted that in the future, the PC is going to avoid using the sentence verbiage so that we do not have similar issues. We will come up with other ways to avoid text being applied if we need to. So the overwhelming opinion was that the intention of Saruman's staff was to permit Saruman to participate in archery fire and skirmishes, and so any copies of Saruman whose first sentence does not involve such a restriction are likely not really intended to interact with the staff at all, especially considering that the ability is an optional one that does not need to be activated if it is not beneficial to the shadow player. Due to each of the various interpretations all being awkward in one way or another, Legacy Rules prefers to just say that it doesn't have any effect at all and thus avoid any possible issues with precedent. All right. Plain and simple. I don't think that there's really anything to go over more on that. So let's just move ahead. Now, Legacy Ruling number 7 is not quite ready for us to announce yet, so we're going to skip right over that. And actually, here is another case, Legacy Ruling number 8. Now, this is one that we have a preliminary decision on, but we don't have our full announcement yet. We are going to announce this just so that people can be aware of what we've gone with, but we are going to be issuing a fuller decision in the future that will completely put this one to rest. So, Sting, Bane of the 8 Legs. It states the bearer must be Frodo or Sam, and it has a response action. If a fierce skirmish involving bearer is about to end, add a threat to discard a minion involved in that skirmish. So this was originally coded on GEMP even before the Grand Card rework, but also after, to resolve in such a way that if the wielder of Sting is overwhelmed, then they're going to be killed, and then Sting would get discarded. And then, of course, because Sting is discarded, it's no longer on the table, so you cannot utilize its response action. However, during this time period, there were a whole lot of bugs being submitted because the Grand Card rework affected over 2,000 cards, and so there were lots and lots and lots of interactions that were now not working and needed to be addressed. And so, as this particular one was reported at least 3 or 4 times, and so I saw it and was like, okay, well, if all these people think that it's a bug, I suppose that it must be. And then so I fixed it, which is to say that I broke it, and made it so that Sting would now work if its bearer was about to be overwhelmed. You could instead add a threat. It would discard the minion that was about to overwhelm them, and then they wouldn't be overwhelmed. Which is to say that this basically made it so that Frodo and Sam could not be overwhelmed ever in a fierce skirmish. Because they would just add a threat and get rid of whoever it was that was about to take them out. However, as soon as this behavior was implemented, the number of bugs being reported for Sting did not stop, because people were now like, well, hey, why are you doing it this way when it was not done that way before? And so we just needed to bring it before the team to try and figure out what exactly is the way that this needs to work. Now we've got more people spamming, and I still have not figured out how to... Well, whatever. Okay, now, so basically what we need to do is we need to come up with a very structured step-by-step process of what order everything happens in the skirmish phase. So if I were to take, let me just grab Comprehensive Rules 4.2 here. If we jump to playing a card, you'll find that there's a section that breaks down what precisely happens at every single step as you play a card. All the different ways that different triggers interact with it, and how you're to interpret it on a very, very fine-grained level. And this really makes it very, very clear what's happening through the entire process. There's another section here for moving your fellowship that also breaks it down step by step into when exactly each of the various triggers happen. And so we are basically just going to be doing the exact same thing for the skirmish phase, giving a step-by-step ruling on how exactly all the individual substeps are to be interpreted. One of the things that we're going to be doing is putting it to bed exactly how Footman's Armor is supposed to work. There was a ruling that was issued by Decipher on this, but now this is going to be part of the entire process. It should now, in theory, no longer need a ruling, because it will be part of the process there, part of the step-by-step process that we're going to be issuing. But we're not quite done with that yet. And rather than make the community wait for that entire proposal to be put together and argued over, we are going to be issuing just a preliminary decision that the Legacy Rules is going to... Legacy Rules team is going to declare that the Sting Bane of the Eight Legs should work the way that it was before, which is to say that it should not trigger after being overwhelmed. When a character is overwhelmed, they are killed, and being killed, all cards attached to them are discarded, and this clearly happens before the skirmish has officially ended. In particular, there's a section here in the Comprehensive Rules that states... A skirmish phase ends after all actions triggered by winning or losing that skirmish have resolved. So one of the things that occurs when you lose a skirmish is that you apply either a wound or you overwhelm the loser. And so that means that while the individual is getting overwhelmed, while they're getting killed, the skirmish phase is not yet ended. So they get killed, Sting gets discarded, and then the skirmish finally ends as soon as all those ramifications have occurred. But you can't have Sting reacting when it's already in the discard pile. That clearly does not make any sense. Okay, so yeah, we just want everyone to be aware of that. We will in the future be talking about this again when we have the full breakdown. We'll go step by step and show everybody exactly how we expect the skirmish phases should work. But we wanted to make sure that this preliminary ruling was out there. And so that's it for the Legacy Rules team. However, the Modern Rules team has a couple of rulings as well that we're going to be issuing. So the first one, actually, I say just Modern Rules team. This first one was actually a collaboration between both the Modern Rules team and the Legacy Rules team. So this has to do with terrain keywords. So the term terrain was used on exactly one card, White Hand Attacker here. It states, while this minion is assigned to a skirmish, each site on the adventure path gains each terrain keyword from each site you control. Now, it seems pretty obvious that when they say terrain keyword, they are probably referring to those keywords that are unique to a particular site. However, it doesn't actually really define this anywhere. That was a term that only showed up on this particular card. And I will point out that the terrain part wasn't even really necessary. It could have just said gains each keyword and it wouldn't have mattered, because a keyword's a keyword either way. But so we're gonna come up with a definition specifically for what terrain means. And the only real sticking point, I think, is the fact that one of those keywords is sanctuary. And that could be a little bit awkward if you had a card that was controlled in your support area here that was a sanctuary, you could, in theory, be making it so that every card on the adventure path, each side on the adventure path, gains Sanctuary, which could be a little awkward. There was also the argument put forward that perhaps terrain keywords should be taken literally, so it should not include any of the keywords here that are not aspects of the terrain. So that would be battleground and dwelling, and sanctuary would be eliminated because of that, because it is not part of the natural viewing of the particular terrain. And then the only other point to bring up is that the PC has been using this term with the Ceradon Dam card that was added to V1 late last year. We have an artifact here that says the rivers and sites with no other terrain keywords gain marsh. And so the real question becomes, well, does a card that is a sanctuary with no other terrain keywords, does that count? And does that get affected by gaining marsh from Ceradon Dam or not? So that's really why this became a collaboration between both the Legacy rules team and the Modern rules team, because we had both a modern situation that we had to rule on, and we had the old card from set 17 that needed to be ruled on. Yeah, so basically the decision that we went with is that together we have opted for a definition that includes all site-specific unloaded keywords and specifically excluded Sanctuary. The Comprehensive Rules 4.2 and 5.0 will both have the following entry added under Section 2, Glossary of Terms. So this will be a new section being added. Terrain. A terrain keyword is an unloaded keyword that is only found on sites. The following are all terrain keywords: battleground, dwelling, forest, marsh, mountain, plains, river, underground. Sanctuary is a loaded keyword that appears on some movie block era sites. It is not a terrain keyword. And then we will also be adding a See Also Terrain line that will be added to the end of the Sanctuary entry. So the intent behind the term terrain is fairly clear, even if the necessity of having the term is more dubious. After all, White Hand Attacker could have just said each keyword and nothing would have changed. By the time of Hunter's Block, Sanctuary was no longer a term printed on cards and was relegated to a rules-based application, which meant that there was never an opportunity for that keyword to misbehave during the Decipher era. If such a circumstance were to arise, however, it is fairly obvious that applying Sanctuary to sites that did not originally have them is rife for chaos. None of the other site keywords being unloaded could come close in impact. All right, so that's that. This isn't really going to change much about White Hand Attacker, unless, of course, he ends up in a situation where he's playing on a multipath rules for some reason. Then he will not be able to apply Sanctuary willy-nilly. And then this is also going to alter how Ceradon Dam works, because as of today, Ceradon Dam will not work if it will not apply Marsh to a card to a site that has Sanctuary and no other keywords. But after this ruling is enacted, it will. Okay, and then modern ruling number 2. So this is exhausting as a cost. So exhaust is pretty obvious as to how it's supposed to work within the way that Decipher tended to use it. But what the thing is, Decipher never used it as a cost. They always used it as an effect. So you were like exerting Eowyn to exhaust a minion or something. So it didn't matter necessarily if that minion was already exhausted or if like whatever the particulars were, right? But here, with this Mary that was released in V1, we, for the first time, have exhausting as a cost. So we have this assignment action: exert Mary 3 times to prevent a minion from being assigned to a skirmish until the regroup phase. The shadow player may exhaust that minion to prevent this. So if the shadow player is able to exhaust that minion, really becomes a question here as to whether or not they are allowed to prevent it. So the way that it currently works with Mary is that if he uses his ability on an exhausted minion, the way that Gemp currently interprets it is that it does not actually have any restrictions for exhaust. You can exhaust an already exhausted minion. You can exhaust a site if you want to. It always accepts the exhaust action as having successfully been performed. And so that means that if Mary attempts to use his ability on an exhausted companion, then it doesn't work, basically. But we really want to hammer out the details here and try to figure out if exhaust can be used in other, how exactly it is supposed to be used. So let's look at some of the rules references here. So under exhausted, we have the instruction on what exactly exhausting means. To exhaust a character means to exert that character as many times as you can. And so the primary question here is, well, if 0 is as many times as you can exhaust them, does that mean that you've successfully, or as many times as you can exert them, have you successfully exhausted them? There's also, under the exhausted section, no player may exert a character who is exhausted. If the effect of an action says a character must exert and that character is exhausted, then nothing happens. So this sort of seems to imply that the exhaustion fails to be fulfilled as a cost. But again, it's kind of a gap. It's not really explicitly laid out. And then the exert section includes, if the cost of an action requires a character to exert X times, then that character must have X plus 1 or more vitality, or that action cannot be performed. A character cannot exert 0 times to pay the cost of a card that requires a character to exert X times. So this is useful, and it does seem to imply, in fact, that you cannot exhaust a character and successfully pay its cost unless they at least have one vitality. There are a couple of cards that have rulings from Decipher that also make sense to look at. Terrible and Evil, which really just kind of dovetails with this exact same exhausted section that we just read. It says, exert Gandalf X times to wound a minion X times, and this was ruled to say if Gandalf is exhausted, he cannot exert to pay the cost of this card, even if X is equal to 0. This ruling may not have been necessary, but it was really just pointing to the rule that already existed that stated that you cannot do that, in fact. But then Elisar's Edict, which is an interesting one. In set 8, we have this card that says, if a Gondor Wraith is about to be killed, discard him and exhaust another Gondor Wraith instead. And so this sort of seems very similar, that it's almost like, okay, you're going to be exchanging this action for another. It seems like it would be right up our alley. However, they altered the wording with a clarification that they issued. If a Gondor Wraith is about to be killed, discard him and either exhaust another Gondor Wraith or spot another exhausted Gondor Wraith to prevent that. So it's difficult to tell if this is supposed to be equivalent to that, or if this is basically just an errata, right? Saying, okay, never mind, do it this way and not that way. In either case, they really sidestepped the decision and didn't really decide whether or not you could, in theory, have exhaust here as almost like a cost-like action. And so it's interesting, but doesn't actually definitively answer things for us. Okay, and so the decision that we have issued for this is that we are going to, in fact, I haven't written it on the wiki yet, but I have it over here on the blog post. The Modern Rules team have opted to make exhaust function largely like exert. You cannot exhaust if already exhausted. You cannot pay for exhaust costs by exerting 0 times. And finally, you do not need to be at full vitality to successfully pay for an exhaustion. So if you have a Balrog that has 4 wounds on it, or no, a Balrog that has 3 wounds on it, you can in fact exhaust him just by exerting him the once. Mary will be issued an errata in the future, as under the terms of this decision, his ability cannot be paid for by exhausted minions, unlike the behavior today, meaning that he will automatically block any exhausted minion with no ability to prevent. And we don't like that, so we're going to be issuing an errata, but that is separate from this decision, and it won't be going out altogether necessarily. Depends on how quickly we can whip something up. All right, so that's that. That's quite a bit today. We've got. So how many is that? That was 3.5 legacy rulings and 2 modern rulings. These will be going out probably within the next week on GEMP. So you can expect those. You can expect an update to be released on that. Oh, got a comment from Mozdru. Cyrano Dam. Yay, that is really good news for my hentai corruption deck. You naughty boy. Yes, and he also says great work. Thanks. Glad to hear. So once again, if you have any comments on these particular rulings, if you have any arguments that you think we may have overlooked, or blog posts or anything like that from Decipher that you think that we haven't found, please post those. Let us know. And if you also have any questions that you would like us to review, please let us know. Some people have already submitted things for us to look at. They are still in the pipeline. We have not forgotten them. They just weren't done yet. But yeah, so that's that. Thank you for tuning in, everybody, and we'll see you all next time. Bye.